Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, which is about oil sales trilemma between KRG, Iraq, and Turkey. My name is Dr. Zeynep Elif Yıldızel, and I've been in oil and gas upstream sector for more than 30 years. I'm an exploration and new ventures expert and acquired many licenses through bidding rounds and direct negotiation and made hydrocarbon discoveries all through my career. Iraq is my special expertise area where I have involved in many projects since 2003 and acquired licenses and drilled wells. Still, I'm in the business, and also I'm lecturing economics of energy resources in Middle East Technical University, and also I wrote a book about energy resources. Today, we are gathered here to address an important topic on oil sales tension between Iraq, KRG, and Turkey's geostrategic position. This trilemma uncovered when, on March 2023, the Paris-based International Chamber of Commerce penalized Turkey for $1.5 billion payment in the favor of Iraq, which is for the produced oil from KRG during 2014 and 2018. We all know this. The so-called export occurred through the pipeline through KRG to Ceyhan, from KRG to Ceyhan, via 400,000 barrels per day, which is approximately the 10% of total export of Iraq and 5% of the global production. The pipeline was constructed in 2013, and it is constructed to promote independent export of KRG produced oils previously carried by tankers. And the government of Iraq had claimed that use of the pipeline from northern Iraq to Ceyhan port to Turkey by KRG without the consent of federal government, it is a violation of a bilateral agreement between the two countries since 1973, because the annex says Turkey would only buy oil from state-owned SOMA. The pipeline was immediately closed by Turkey on 25th of March, which cost approximately $30 billion per day to KRG. And it is very important. And on April of 2023, the government of Iraq and KRG reached a consent, an agreement method for export, but still the pipeline is closed by unilateral action of Turkey. So we have two distinguished expert panelists here, and I would like to thank to Herdem attorneys, and also to let me find the correct name. Ankara Politikalar Merkezi, that made us available for this webinar. I'm going to tell about my panelists before, and I would like to introduce them to you. Our panelist, Mr. Eser Özdil, we know each other for 10 years, and he is the founder and managing director of Local Group Consulting Investment and Trade, and a non-resident fellow with Atlantic Council in Turkey. He has 14 years of business experience in energy sector, and between 2012 and 2020, he worked as a Secretary General in the Petroleum and Natural Gas Platform Association in Turkey, which is regarded as one of the most influential sector organizations in the Turkish oil and gas industry. He participated in various official meetings of international organizations, namely the Union for the Mediterranean, EU, World Bank, and Organization for Economic Cooperation, and so forth. Our second panelist is Ms. Lizzie Porter. She is the senior correspondent in Iraq Oil Report. She knows everything from the field. And we know, all the fellows from the industry working in the region, we follow the Iraq Oil Report on daily basis. She is a senior correspondent in Iraq Oil Report, covering energy politics and security. Her publications appeared in mainstream media channels such as Telegram Media Groups, Monochrome BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and so forth. Porter was also the gold winner of 30 to Watch Young Journalist Awards in 2020 and Foreign Reporter of the Year by the Women Awards in 2019. The Guardian Student Reporter in 2012. She has a very good background in journalism. Before focusing on Iraq, she was based in Lebanon, covering major anti-government protests and riots in 2019 and 2020. She received her bachelor's degree from University of Oxford and master's from American University of Beirut in Middle East Studies. Before giving them the opportunity to speak, I would like to address some questions to the audience and to the speakers also, because we have to think all together about these questions. There is an Iraqi constitutional law, and the KRG was defined as a region and given the rights to export from its own fields that are being found or that are being discovered after 2003. So is this the main reason for all tension between KRG and the government of Iraq? And this is an important topic. And the other question is, KRG is giving production sharing agreements and the government of Iraq giving service contracts. And from the industry, we know that in exploration phases, we like the production sharing agreements too much. So shall this rise another conflict? And what are the consequences of lack of unified petroleum law between federal government of Iraq and KRG, since they have different petroleum laws, and KRG passed its law in 2007 and federal government passed its law in 2018. And also the most important thing is that what is being awaited for the oil companies, especially operating in KRG, if reconciliation process of oil sales between Iraqi government, KRG, and Turkey has not been achieved, has not been solved. And the influence of the decision on KRG's economy, because the KRG is paying back to the operators. So it is very important. Also, not the operators, there are service companies, cement companies, and other logistics, and other many more companies working in the KRG region, which is affected from this problem. And there is also the influence of KRG gas fields, that we need gas in Turkey, and it is Turkey's geostrategic position is important. And after the Russia and Ukraine invasion, European demand is also triggered by this invasion, and the gas in Iraq is also important for the European Union. The influence of this penalty for Turkey and its companies, especially working in Iraq and KRG, and Turkey's importance as a geostrategic position, and also increasing Shia power on the federal government of Iraq, and Turkey's increasing Iran threat perception and its implication in the Iraq policy. These are the major topics that rise in my brain. So if you, the audience, have other topics, please feel free to ask after the panel's talk is finished. So I would like to give the stage first to Ms. Lisa Porter. She's going to talk about a little bit background and the other stuff, and then Mr. Eser Özdil. Lisa, you have 15 minutes. Thank you much.
Thank you very much for that expansive introduction, Dr. Zeynep. Günaydın, iyi günler, Slau, and salam alaikum to everyone. Essentially, the problem starts with the ambiguity of the Iraqi constitution. And this is not just on oil and gas, it's ambiguous on many different topics. It's highly open to interpretation. So when it comes to oil and gas resources, it says that they belong to the people of Iraq. For one, and I agree with that, these things, these are Iraqi resources for Iraqi people, but that causes problems because anyone trying to produce these resources can very easily be accused of sort of stealing the Iraqi people's goods, the Iraqi people's wealth and resources. That means that it can often and has often led to kind of populist campaigning that blocks development of resources and pipelines. One example recently in the south has been the expansion or development of a secondary pipeline for exports into Jordan. There was a lot of accusations that would lead to the stealing of Iraq's resources. While actually it would be a good alternative export route if anything happens in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, and we know that's not the most stable of seaways, it would provide an alternative route. But that's one issue with the wording of the constitution. To the point of the Erbil-Baghdad divide, the KRG, as you referred to there, Dr. Zainab, the KRG interprets the constitution to mean that as an autonomous region, it has the right to produce and market its own oil and gas. This is furthered by the absence of a national oil and gas law, which they talked about it in 2018, and there was movement towards it, but they haven't actually passed that. That would define the contours of who, on a governorate level, on a regional level, would have the right to do what around producing, marketing the oil in each and distributing the wealth of the oil resources in each province or region of Iraq. Lawmakers, because you've got because of the system, because of the parliamentary system in Iraq, lawmakers have never been able to come to an agreement and pass that law. They've gone, they do it in stages. When they vote on a law, they've got to the stage where they voted on, a number of articles within the law, and then they've got to a certain stage and haven't been able to agree. And so they've gone back to the drawing table. There have been a lot of talk recently about MPs on the Oil and Gas Committee in the parliament in Baghdad saying, yes, we're going to get it passed by the end of the year. An MP told one of my colleagues in an interview that recently. And I think the PM Sudani had a meeting specifically on this issue this morning. I'm skeptical because it's not clear to me that the conditions that everyone still sees eye to eye to a sufficient extent to be able to pass a law. So I'm skeptical about the talk that, yes, we are finally going to have an oil and gas law. So in the absence of a federal law in 2007, as you mentioned, the KRG passed its own oil and gas legislation. This created a fact on the ground to stand up its independent oil sector, and a legal basis for producing oil and controlling the revenues that flowed from that. It signed production sharing contracts with IOCs, developed its fields. At the beginning, we're talking, the sort of 2008, 2009, 2010, it monetized this crude in any way it could. It trucked to Turkey and Iran, and there was lots of sort of teapot refineries locally. In 2013, and this is a big moment, it signed a strategic agreement with Turkey to export crude using the pipeline to Ceyhan. This meant that it could export a lot more because you can export a lot more through a pipeline than you can through trucking. And this would involve the usage of the Turkey leg of the Iraq-Turkey pipeline. The first oil cargo to Ceyhan was sold in 2014, but really, like a couple of days after that, Iraq filed the ICC arbitration case, arguing that the use of the ITP without Baghdad's specific consent violated the ITP usage treaty terms from the 1973 treaty between Baghdad and Ankara. That case was massively delayed, but this year a ruling was the legal experts, lawyers based in Paris issued a ruling in Baghdad's favor, as you mentioned, and that KRG can no longer export through the ITP without Baghdad's express permission. Turkey then shut the pipeline. Because you don't want to incur any more legal damages or legal liability by continuing to export oil or allow the loading of oil at Ceyhan that has been exported through a pipeline whose usage has violated the terms of a usage treaty. So as you said, Turkey hasn't turned the pipeline back on. And I know we've got a section later on this specific arbitration case. So it was a really big watershed moment. This was in addition to ongoing tension and between the KRG and the central government over the KRG oil sector, because of this belief in Baghdad that the KRG is operating in a way that violates the constitution. And in February 2022, Iraq's federal Supreme Court ruled that the 2007 KRG oil and gas law violated the Iraqi constitution. And the federal government really started to make efforts to curb the oil sector in the Kurdistan region by, saying oil service companies will not be able to work in federal Iraq if they work there, opening legal cases in Baghdad against some of the operators in the KRG. Work there continued despite this FSC ruling. However, it did complicate the passage of a public budget in Iraq, because the agreements that had previously governed the allocations of money to the KRG from the central budget, they no longer worked, because they would implicitly recognize the independence of the KRG oil sector, and therefore not abide by the FSC ruling and be open to potential further legal challenge. So that complicated things greatly. And in 2022, we didn't have a budget in Iraq for the whole year. In 2023, they have finally just recently passed a budget for 2023, despite the fact we're halfway through the year already, 2024 and 2025, with a new formula, a new kind of modus operandi for revenue sharing between the KRG and Baghdad. This is in light of the federal Supreme Court ruling last year and in the light of the ICC ruling against the usage of the ITP Iraq. Sorry, I keep using acronyms. I hate them myself. In light of the ICC ruling against the usage of the Iraq-Turkey pipeline without Baghdad's express say-so. Under this new agreement, and this is it kind of reshapes the relationship between Baghdad and Erbil. The government of Iraq controls revenue from exports, and the KRG must contribute 400,000 barrels a day from exports to Jehan in order to be eligible for a full budget transfer from Baghdad. In the event of the pipeline being closed, which is what we're seeing at the moment, the KRG must hand over up to 400,000 barrels to the oil ministry for usage domestically. Now, we have seen that start to happen in the past week. Around 55,000 barrels a day are going from Kurdistan region control fields into refineries, also in the Kurdistan region. But they are the products that come from that crude oil, so the products that result from the refining, are owned by the oil ministry, and the oil ministry can do what it wants with those. So we're seeing a partial implementation of these of this new budget arrangement that has come in the light of these legal challenges to the KRG's oil sector. The closure of the ITP obviously makes things more difficult, because the KRG doesn't have an obvious route to markets, and the Iraqi government cannot easily absorb 400,000 barrels a day in its refineries. So there is a real incentive for the pipeline to reopen for the KRG, so it can provide the amount of exports it needs in order to enable a full budget transfer from Baghdad. There are other problems with that I know the Kurdistan region and IOCs, international oil companies operating there, are very concerned about, which is that the way the budget allocation has been calculated in Baghdad, even if Kurdistan region hands over 400,000 barrels a day, is not enough to cover the IOC operating costs and the profit that it's supposed to get on top of the sort of your operating costs plus profit. It's not enough to cover those. And so I think there's some feeling in the KRG that this budget agreement does really not work for the KRG, and it's going to and in the way that it's calculated based on costs in federal Iraq, which are different from field costs in KRG because the fields are different, the maturity of the fields is different. So there are a lot of concerns in the KRG that even if it's implemented as it says on paper, that KRG is not going to be able to meet its costs based on this new formula. Yeah, so this is sort of a little bit of deep background and some more up-to-date issues. I don't know how much longer I've got, or whether I should go on to the more stuff around the ICC ruling and the fallout from that.
5 minutes left.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the relevance of the ICC decision and where that's at now. As I said, the key finding was that Turkey cannot facilitate KRG exports through that pipeline and load oil that comes through that pipeline at Ceyhan without Baghdad's express permission. Now, Baghdad has said to Turkey, please turn the pipeline back on. They have sent an order. Turkey has not turned that back on yet. And the belief in Baghdad and Erbil is that Turkey is not doing so because it wants to create room for negotiation around the compensation payments, which, given some counterclaims, as you said, Dr. Zeynep, is around 1.5 billion, and to create negotiation room around an ongoing arbitration case, which covers oil exports from 2018 to around the present, so to 2022, to when the pipeline was turned off. At the moment, Turkey is saying we need to do repair work on the pipeline. But as I say, I think the belief in Erbil and Baghdad is that this is more to create room for negotiation on these large sums of money, and potentially even larger sums of money that might come, Turkey might be ordered to pay from the ongoing arbitration case, which hasn't been ruled on yet. The outage is causing quite a lot of difficulty and uncertainty and stress, I know, in the Kurdistan region. Companies have massively cut their costs. They have laid off workers. The fields are shut in. Some crude, is going into domestic refineries for so producing oil products for local consumption, but that's not, those aren't able to absorb 400,000 barrels a day. So fields are really shut in, and all of this, and the companies aren't being paid. And this is in addition to debts that the KRG already had to the IOCs. I think Genel, which is an Anglo-Turkish company, it said that their last payment was made in March for September 22 sales, and they alone are owed $110 million by the KRG. So, and you add all the other companies that are operating in the KRG, and there is a lot of money owed to them, and the whole thing doesn't look very good for the KRG's investment environment. So it's
1 minute.
Yeah, there is a lot of impetus, for the KRG to try and get the pipeline back online, and they really see it that this is still an issue that involves Turkey, because they say, well, we've come to this agreement and we've passed a budget that governs how our revenue is shared. Baghdad takes control of it, and then but Erbil gets a share of that, and now it's up to Turkey or Baghdad and Turkey to negotiate to try and get the means for the revenue, for the exports, which brings in the revenue to come back online. So it's a pretty critical juncture still, and we're all watching it quite carefully.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for your brief explanation about the past and how we come here. I want to pinpoint some notes here before I pass to Eser Bey. You said that the companies were not working or dismissed when they are working in Baghdad and Northern Iraq, KRG. But there is one exception, Exxon. Exxon was voluntarily working in Baghdad plus in KRG before, and an exception was given to her in the previous years. And also you said about the domestic sales. Yes, everybody's trying to put their production to domestic sales. And you mentioned about the Genel Enerji. Today they say that they are also trying to put their effort on domestic sales for the refineries and so forth, but who's going to give how much production to those domestic sales is another big question, that there is not only Genel over there, there are many other operators there. So thank you very much. We'll come back to those topics again, and I'm going to pass the conversation or to the stage to Mr. Eser Özdil. Yes, Mr. Eser Özdil, we are waiting for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zeynep, and thank you very much for Globaltradeforum and Ankara Policy Center for inviting us in this very valuable panel. And I would like to salute all the distinguished gatherings who are listening to our opinions in this panel. Well, basically, I want to construct my speech under two major questions. The first question is, what was the motivation of Turkey in allowing oil flow from KRG back in 2014, and also what was the motivation of Turkey in developing political relations with Kurdistan region of Iraq since 2008. This is, I think, very crucial to understand the current situation. The second, as Lizzie explained, what is the current stance of the Turkish government and why it changed after 2017 independence referendum, and how we can move forward from the current point, because it's clear that this is not the benefit for all parties in the current situation. So what could be the possible solution scenarios? I'm not going to talk more about the history, but as you may remember, the current Party government has increased the political and economic relations with the KRG region, especially since 2006 and 2007. And of course, the production sharing agreements, as well as increasing economic integration between Turkey and KRG, was important in order to create an economic benefits for the both parties. And as of 2009 and 2010, also Turkish government wanted to be part of this concessions in the KRG region. And as you may remember very well, that Dr. Zeynep, that the Turkish Petrol and International Corporation, the TIPIC, also signed cooperation agreement with ExxonMobil for several fields for the exploration activities, and also they invest some amounts to explore in these regions. And of course, the Genel then was a Turkish company, and then of course it's merged with a British venture capital company. Also, flowing oil from KRG to Turkey was an important element to increase KRG incomes. And when it comes to 2013 and 2014, basically the geopolitical conjuncture was very important, because at that time ISIS was very active in Iraq and in Syria, and basically KRG pipeline was not operational, and central government was not able to flow oil to Turkey. And also the KRG was facing very serious threat from ISIS. And I do remember very well that in 2014, because we were discussing with friends in the field, and they were like 10 kilometers away from the ISIS front, basically. And that was a very difficult period for KRG to sustain their, let's say, war or struggle versus ISIS, and oil flows was very crucial for that activities. And from the Turkish point of view, basically in allowing the KRG oil flows, the first, of course, was to help the KRG government financially. The second, with the amendment of the transportation agreement between Soma and BOTAŞ back in 2010, the agreement was giving 100% capacity to Soma, but of course, in the article, there was an ambiguous point, which was clearly referring that BOTAŞ should receive the oil flows which are coming from Iraq. So basically, that was not separating KRG or central government of Iraq. So that was the main motivation of the BOTAŞ, was allowing oil flows to KRG fields as well. So which also triggered this arbitration case and later on. But after 2017, why the situation started to change? The first, basically, Turkey never supported the independence referendum of the KRG. So Turkey, yes, was establishing good connections with KRG, but on the other hand, Turkey was considering as a political threat an independent Kurdish government or Kurdish country in the region because of the high Kurdish minorities in Turkey. So that was a very critical political shift in Turkish position versus KRG. Secondly, also the increasing cooperation between the KRG government and the Northern Syrian administrations also sparked Turkey's concerns about the security issue. So that's why increasing activities of YPG, increasing activities of the Kurdish groups in the northern Syria, and cooperation to some extent between the KRG also decreased Turkey's appetite to cooperate with KRGs again. And a third reason that we know from the decision makers, that basically in the arbitration case, KRG didn't support enough the Turkey's legal arguments, and that created a big disappointment in the Turkish decision makers as well. So that was another point that why we are right now cannot see a very full cooperation between the KRG and the Turkish decision makers. And as of onwards 2020, Turkey also changed its political perspective to the entire region, because between 2010 and 2020, let's say for the 10 years, actually Turkey had very weak relations with the central government, including Syria, in Iraq, as well as there were serious geopolitical tug of war between other regional countries like Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, even United Arab Emirates to some extent. But since 2020, we see that Turkey's political relations, or a kind of a restructuring relations between the regional governments, are also in increasing trend. So that's why Turkey wants to cooperate more with Baghdad government rather than KRG government since 2020. So that, after having said that, also after announcement of the ICC decision, Turkey's position is quite clear from my point of view, because if you look at the first verdict, it says that, of course, Somoza charged something like $600 million for non-oil transfer via the pipeline, because also there is a ship or pay clause in the agreement. If someone cannot ship enough oil, then actually they have to pay the transportation fee. But in return, also Turkey was charged around $1.4 billion for the breach of the article clauses. And that's why Turkey's position is quite clear. If that's the case, if that's the verdict, and basically someone should transfer all the oil. And I'm not going to transfer oil of any other parties from the region. Of course, as Lisa said, that the background is trying to create a negotiation table to solve the problem bilaterally before expecting another verdict from the court. But on the other hand, from my point of view, Turkey's situation is also quite understandable, because okay, Turkey took a kind of action in order to help the KRG, as well as in order to increase oil exports from Iraq. But in return, Turkey is face to face with some substantial amount of penalties. So after this point of view, if there is no political solution, basically you cannot expect any more from the Turkey. But this is quite understandable. But this is creating a problem for all parties as well, because the first problem is that, as Lisa explained very well, that even if 400,000 barrels oil is exported per day, it's barely covering the responsibility of the KRG, because the current share of the KRG government from central government is around $12 billion per year in accordance with the population ratio. And with the current levels, basically you can get this income if you can export almost 400,000 barrels. Basically, that's a problem, and that we should see increasing amount of exports, but also there are big question marks of the there are big question marks on the capacities of the production of these fields. Secondly, the second, I think even more important, the gas exports. Because if KRG is able to cover its responsibilities versus central government, oil is not going to be enough. They need to find some other materials to export. This is gas, what we know from the years, and actually a third element could be mines and minerals. But since oil export is blocked and there is no consensus between KRG and Baghdad right now, basically we cannot even talk about gas exports because this is the blocker. The oil export is the blocker. Since the oil export is the blocker, we cannot talk about gas exports. We cannot talk about mine exports, and this is creating a lose-lose equilibrium for KRG and central government of Baghdad. And I'm sorry, I'm going to finish in 1 minute. Then maybe Lizzie, you can add your opinions as well. And the second issue is that, especially after the war in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, basically all parties are looking for new gas export routes, and there's a big advantage right now, basically, because Gazprom was selling almost 150 BCM of gas to European countries before the war, and bulk of this gas was replaced by LNG producers, and of course almost 50 BCM consumption was decreased in EU. But still, for the sustainable energy balance in EU, they need another at least 60 to 70 BCM of new export routes. Of course, KRG will not be able to export that level, that amount of gas, but at least there is a capacity, or there is a technical capacity to export at least 10 to 15 BCM, which is substantial. And this gas can only go to Europe via Turkey in a very economical way, thanks to Turkish gas grid. And again, basically, this oil export problem is bringing us to a problem to gas exports. The third issue, I'm going to talk about the mines, because I know that like 2 or 3 years ago, the KRG government was trying to enact a kind of a mining law in order to attract investments from international companies, but they couldn't be, but they failed. Why? The reason is simple, because even for the oil, there is no clear export option. So how the mining companies will come and invest, basically. So the consultation is also over that. So that's why, if you ask my opinion, this oil export problem is just one side of the medallion. And there are other big problems on the other side of the medallion. And basically, in the future, if there is no solution, I think the KRG budget problem will remain, and there is going to create some other problems in the country as well, like social problems or even riots to some extent. So I want to finish here, then I can continue at the Q&A section, but please go on, Lizzie, if you have.
I just had a couple of things to add on gas, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So the gas, definitely. No, I very much agree that there are a lot of issues around exporting gas. One big one is not just a Baghdad. So there are a couple of layers of this. There's a Baghdad Erbil issue. Like last year, we saw that the FSC ruling said that the oil and gas law in the Kurdistan region is unconstitutional. And that's, so you've got questions over or challenges to the legal basis on which that gas is produced. Then, and we saw, a big challenge to that. Do you really want to, is it going to be possible to export that gas without Baghdad's, in the presence of that FSC ruling that says that the oil and gas law is unconstitutional? That's one question. You also have an intra-Kurdish problem. This is it's one of the consequences of the lack of unity in the Kurdistan regional government. Most of the gas is in areas controlled by the PUK, which is one of the main parties that makes up the KRG, the other being the KDP. Lots of acronyms here. The problem is that they don't agree on how to build the infrastructure. The PUK leaders are adamant that any way that the gas resources, and we're talking mostly about Hormuz and Chamchamal, that's where a lot of the gas is, any further development of that to take it across to Dohuk and eventually to exports into Turkey needs to ensure that Suleymaniye province sees the revenue coming back, sees some benefit from that. Because at the moment they say, well, we don't like the way that the oil is exploited because Suleymaniye doesn't see any of the revenue or little of the revenue from that. We don't want the same thing to happen with gas, especially because it's in our area. So at the moment, you've got some work going on a pipeline in KDP-controlled areas, on a gas pipeline, but like little happening in PUK-controlled areas. And so with this political tension going on and disagreements between the two parties in the KRG, that's another factor that massively sets back any idea of gas exports. You've also got the problem that KRG has to fulfill domestic demand before it exports. And you've got a 1,100 megawatt power station in Dohuk standing idle. That needs to be fulfilled and used before you can think about exports. You've also got, does KRG decide to send gas to federal Iraq, not to Turkey? So really this idea that KRG or, Iraqi gas is going to suddenly replace Russian gas is there are a lot of factors we need to think about before, we can see Kurdish or Iraqi gas going to Europe. It would have to go via Turkey.
Yeah, Lizzie, I think there are some questions. You are pinpointing the very important things about the gas issue. Gas issue is important, yes. But let's take some questions. And before passing to question and answer, I would like to pinpoint something about the Sarbay's speech. As it's mentioned that, and you also mentioned, and Sarbay also mentioned that there is a consensus, that there seems to be a consensus between KRG and the federal government of Iraq about the payments, that when the Turkey opens the pipeline, then everything will be sold. It seems like this, but this is not the case. There are audiences most probably have been in this industry, in these companies operating in the KRG. They may remember that Dr. Ashta Havrami, during that time, he sent produced oil to SOMO, and in return they only got 17% of the whole sales, not their own also. And this rose another conflict between them. I feel that there will be those conflicts in the near future. This trilemma will be a dilemma between KRG and Iraq in the near future. So there is a question for Mr. Sarbay, and before that, Mr. Sayar just asked about and mentioned that the Crescent also is an operator in Baghdad and KRG both. Yes, Exxon, and they have these privileges. Exxon is very, very strong company, so Sheristani did nothing about that. But the Sinopec, the Chinese company, was laid off from Baghdad when she tried to enter into KRG, you may remember. And now, Sarbay, you can just answer the question. And please, the audience, if you have any other questions, please do ask and address whom you are asking, and they're going to answer.
Yeah, the questions about the arbitration, I think you are referring that one, Dr. Zeynep, right?
Yep.
Yeah, the thing is that basically at the early days of the arbitration case launched by the central government of the Iraq, basically there was a frustration in the Turkish decision makers that the KRG decision makers are not supporting well enough with the current clear documents that they have with the central government of the Baghdad, and they are not even participating to do meetings with the lawyers and etc. So that created a kind of a mistrust and untrust, let's say, from the Turkish decision makers. This is what I'm referring from my face-to-face meeting with the relevant decision makers, and these informations, of course, are not publicly available. The second question was about how the current...
How did the KRG didn't support Turkey in the arbitrage?
Yes, arbitration. Yes, that's the question that I answered. The second question, I think there's another question of Mr. Bilgin. What would resolve the deadlock at this moment as Turkey being exposed to penalty and Iraq is limited on its sales channels? The thing is that it's clear that Turkey doesn't want to pay a penalty, and Turkey doesn't believe that it's the fault of the country. Basically, Turkey believes that they just facilitated the oil exports, and the main income sharing problem is between KRG and Iraq. So Turkey is expecting a kind of a political solution. And as long as there is no political solution, I don't believe that Turkey will change the current situation and current status. So that's the major deadlock. And I think the only solution can be achieved via political negotiations between the parties. I don't know if KRG maybe will take the responsibility of the payment of the penalties, or maybe the central government will take back their claims from the court in Paris. You know, this kind of political solution might be possible.
Yeah, I think one of the things is it's definitely always included a political element. I think the problem is that the issues on which Iraq wants Turkey to concede on are non-negotiables for Turkey. You know, things like, you know, things that annoy Iraq about the relationship include water sharing and the presence of Turkish military in northern Iraq. You know, and if Iraq was to ask for concessions on those things and say, yes, we'll waive the money in exchange for X or Y, those are issues that Turkey finds that are just a no-no for Turkey in terms of concessions. So and at the same time, Iraq knows that it kind of needs Turkey as a very important trade partner, as a export route. So it's got a kind of, there's a very fine tightrope walking in this relationship. And I don't clearly see a way out of it, apart from coming from the very top levels of governance in both countries to come to a solution over it. It's going to have to come right from the top.
Mr. Gökhan Yardım had another question. If Turkish gas market is fully liberalized, how it affects the relations? I think to both of you.
Which question on the panelists about how they believe the KRG should mediate? Or
no, the Turkish gas market.
Gas market.
It is fully liberalized. What will be the effect?
So I think that's probably one for you a bit more than me. I'm slightly on Turkey, but have more experience on the Iraq side.
Yep.
Well, the problem is political right now. We are not talking about the commercial dynamics. And basically, market liberalization in Turkey, if we assume that we have a liberal gas market, actually the contribution could be quite limited, because as long as there is no political solution to the problem, basically gas flow will not be possible. So that's why even if we have a liberal market or not, I see very limited effect. But if Turkey has a liberalized gas market, of course, it will attract many investments from international companies. Big companies will also come to Turkey, because Turkey is a big gas market, roughly 55 to 60 BCM of consumption. So that's why there could be a leverage from investors' side, both on Turkish government, on KRG government, on central Iraqi government as well. But I assume that, and I know that still in the current situation, most of the operators in the KRG region are trying to increase their lobbying efforts to reach a solution. But I don't see a direct link between market liberalization and solving the political problem right now.
Mr. Sayar asked both of you that to give your opinions on how they believe, or how you believe that the KRG should try to mediate. Should they restructure the fiscal terms of the PSA with the operators within the region, assuming it's legally possible, or do you think that it would be enough?
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think I'd be very happy as an IOC if just being asked, oh, by the way, we owe you millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, but we're also going to try and change the terms of the contract. I don't think I'd be very happy, and particularly given the operating conditions in the KRG at the moment, I don't see how that's possible. You know, without seriously potentially damaging reputation and you know, not being seen as a very easy or you know, business friendly place to work. But I'm not a lawyer, so.
What do you think, Eser Bey?
Well, basically, well, it could be, but still there is a big problem between the KRG government and big investors. So I don't know. They can negotiate, but basically this is not the urgent situation. The urgent situation again between the government levels.
Yeah, the problem about this is that the KRG is giving the production sharing agreements and the Bağdat is giving service contracts. And the operators in KRG obtained production sharing agreements, and they most probably they loaned some money from banks, and the banks in this case the banks will also enter into this situation. It's not easy to change the production sharing agreements to service contracts, or to change the service contracts to production sharing agreements. It's a big disaster. So I don't think there will be a resolution on this, most probably. And there's another question. It is about the arbitration. Mr. Mirani asked that is the second stage of the ICC arbitration for 2018 to 2022 period currently ongoing. SRV, I think it will be your part, or your answer will be.
No, basically, what we know, yes, this is continue, but the first one is finished.
I mean, if it takes the same shape as the last one, it's, you know, delays. We can expect a lot of delays.
Yeah.
The last one was delayed for various reasons, coronavirus. I think one of the arbiters died. There were a lot of problems, and, you know, trying to sort of slow it down a bit. But yeah, so I think it's ongoing. As I understand, in the ICC don't say anything about what's going on publicly. But slow, I would hazard a guess.
The last question is, I think Mr. Bibi asked that, is there any interest payment compensation for IOCs at KRG for waiting the delayed payback? Both of you, who can answer? I mean,
so I don't understand the question.
Interest rate, yeah, interest rate for the delays.
Oh, interest on delayed payments. I don't know on that. I will say frankly that I don't know.
Yeah.
But I know they're owed tens of millions.
Yeah, and there is another last question before we are going to conclude. Do we know much about how to break the current PSCs the KRG has with the IOCs to a service contract model? Do we know if any IOCs are currently in discussion directly with the Iraqi government? I answered this actually because it cannot be, because the ownership in between the two contracts are very different. The service contract doesn't give you any ownership, but the production sharing contract gives you the ownership. So
Yes.
It will not be resolved, and there is no current conversation about this. And I don't believe that any IOC working in KRG would like to change any kind of contract types. Maybe the Bağdati companies can be in favor of doing this, but the vice versa is impossible.
But then you come back to the problem of the constitution, which, I mean, it's not a problem, but it's just it's a fact that you can't, like, no company can take ownership share of a field in federal Iraq, because the constitution says that it's the Iraqi people who own the oil and gas, no other company can ever own that oil or the fields from which they come.
So our time has come. I want to thank to Mr. Eser Özdil and Mr. Riza Porter for their valuable contribution to this panel, or to this webinar. I also would like to thank to organizers who helped us to do this. First of all, Ankara Policy Center, and it's a prominent Turkish foreign policy think tank group in Ankara. Globaltradeforum, which is also an industrial think tank based in Istanbul. And these topics are very important, especially for the operators working in that region. So I'm very thankful for them, for Mr. Arun Demir also, for Herdem Law also, because these are the things that you see many people are asking questions about what's going on and what's going to be in the near future. So these are very important. So I will thank them for inviting us to such kind of extended webinar. Thank you for all the guests here, and also I will thank my panelists, Lizzie Porter and Eser Özdil, once again for their valuable contribution to this event. So anybody can leave the webinar.
Thank you very much. I hope it was useful.
Thank you for the
See
invitation.
you in connection.
Bye-bye.
Bye.